Our lesson of Scripture this morning comes to us from the book of Exodus. This morning I'm going to be reading from chapter 15, verse number 22, and then from chapter 16, verse number 4. Hear now the reading of God's holy word. Then Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went for 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
There are two ways of looking at life. You can look at life as the journey you make year after year. Some people look at life more in terms of a destination. Life is journey, emphasizes savor every moment as it comes along, stop along the way to smell the roses, don't miss out on anything as you go along. Life is destination. It's more of an approach of setting goals that you work toward, get her done, the things that are in between you and your goals. Always keep your checklist in hand. It's more of a bucket list approach to life. The destination emphasis is where you just done there, been there, check it off, and you're on to the next thing, which makes it kind of hard to smell the roses. The Hebrews, they had a destination, the Promised Land, but they had a journey to make, and the journey kept getting in the way of their destination. I'm going to hold up a map. Tanana's been seeing it. We've been using it in confirmation. It is a map somebody made of the Exodus. Tanana, let me ask you if you will come and just walk this around so folks can get a look at it. Somebody went through all of the book of Exodus and mapped out everything where they went, and the lines is just all over the place. In 40 years, they went crisscrossed places they had been before, went around in circles. It's like a plate of spaghetti. If you want to make a copy of this map, you could put it on a copier, or you could boil a pot of spaghetti noodles and just dump them in the floor, and that would pretty much be the route that the Hebrews made. It's just pretty remarkable to see how they went around in circles for 40 years. Why did they wind up traveling like that? Well, they didn't cooperate with God. They were headstrong. They were independent. They set an example for us of how not to make the journey of life. They paid less attention to God and more attention to their own wants and wishes. And therein lies the lesson for every generation of believers. And the lesson is this: there is a difference between a believer and a follower. A believer can accept God as creator and ruler and not follow God. That's how you do the spaghetti map for 40 years. A believer who is a follower could have done a little bit of a loop and gotten to the promised land in a couple of months. Okay? 3 days across the Red Sea. This miraculous rescue. They were saved. And they get thirsty. And it turns them into complainers. God makes it right, and they go on. 45 days out, they're complaining again. But God, we thank you for the water, but we're hungry. If you were going to kill us out here, starve us to death, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? It would have been easier that way. In fact, if we had known, we might not be here right now. They thought they were following God off into a life of plenty, a life of leisure, to a promised land that was full of milk and honey, and that was the promise. Things were going to be wonderful, and they were going to travel to the promised land in comfort and style, and God was surely going to meet their every need and answer their every whim. Our destinations in life are important. Their destination was very important. Going back to the promised land, their ancestral land. But they didn't handle the journey very well. And the truth is, we've got important destinations in life, things that we want to be. We set our own in life, and there is that destination of the promised land in the ultimate sense, the place we call heaven that God holds out to us. But there's a journey to all of our destinations in life, and how we handle the journey pretty much determines whether or not we're going to be able to enjoy ourselves when we get to the destination. Columbus headed for India. That was his destination. Wound up in the Caribbean. He didn't have a clue where he was. So he named wherever he was the West Indies, assuming that if he just sailed a little bit further, he would be in India. The Pilgrims, they set out from England and they headed for Virginia. They wound up in Massachusetts. Had no idea where they were. I like to tell my friends from Boston, that the Pilgrims really didn't want to be there. But they just got there by accident and they were tired, so they stayed. Think about the places you have been in life that have not been the places that you planned on being. The trip to the Promised Land is only a couple 100 miles, but it took that band of Hebrews 40 years to make the journey. Why? Because life is filled with a lot of detours. Things happen to us in life. God can cause some of our detours. Some of our dead-end streets are of our own doing. Every so often, we kind of step back in life and we kind of tilt our head up to heaven and say, God, you brought me out here. I signed on, as a believer. I accepted Christ. I thought I was following you to glory, but it looks like I'm a long way from glory where I am right now. Maybe I would have been better off to have just left you alone. That's what they said 3,200 years ago, and sometimes that's what we can find our own selves thinking. And some people, when they think that, do fall by the wayside. We all know people who just threw up their hands and walked away from the church and walked away from belief because they assumed that God wasn't everything He was made out to be. The difference is in whether we decide to make God an integral part of the journey of life, or make that journey mostly by ourselves. It's easy enough to pay lip service to God, but when push comes to shove, it's not always an easy thing to trust God. God made us a promise. Made them a promise, makes us a promise. And the promise was that God would get us where He wanted us to be, if we would follow. We accept Christ, and we set out on that journey. The assumption is that we hope it's going to be a bed of roses. Well, it could be a bed of roses, but you know, roses come with thorns. We assume that our trip to glory was because God was on our side, was going to be comfortable and enjoyable and maybe just a little bit easy. But life doesn't look like that, does it? It's not a problem of our not reading the fine print in that contract that we made with God. Because the truth of the matter is, there isn't any fine print. There aren't any hidden clauses. There's not any addenda of add-ons that whereases and wherefores that we simply didn't bother to read. It boils down to our making peace with something that is a lot bigger than we are. And the word that the church has used through the centuries about making that kind of peace with God is surrender. It's something that every generation of preachers, ad infinitum, ad nauseum, has come to hammer home. Now, there's more than one kind of surrender. The kind of surrender that doesn't take any faith is just sort of given in to the chance circumstances of life that come at us, and something knocks us down and we get up, and something else knocks us down, and we just get worn out and get kind of fatalistic about, well, I guess I'll get out of bed this morning and see what else can happen to me. That kind of surrender doesn't take faith, commitment, or anything, because it's kind of like the attitude of the dog we've all seen who has been kicked and yelled at so many times that when anybody comes walking up toward it, it drops its head down and puts its tail down and just kind of slinks off. That's a surrender without backbone. It's the kind of surrender that gives surrender a bad name. The other kind of surrender is to the will of God. And it's nothing more than finally getting around to, after we have tried a number of things on our own that don't work out quite the way we plan for them to work out, admitting that we can't have our lives the way we want them by sheer force of our own wishes and our own will. And that maybe, just maybe, God can do better for us than we've been doing for ourselves. That's a hard conclusion to come to, because we are taught to live your own life, make your own decisions, carve out your own destiny, take responsibility for your life. We hear that at home, we hear that at school, and then all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, no, let God choose your destiny for you. Let God be in charge of your own life. Well, who's right? Those two things seem to be a contradiction, don't they? But they're not a contradiction. A contradiction is two things that seem to be mutually exclusive, that absolutely will not work together, period, under any circumstances. Things like, oil and water. You try to mix them all you want, any way you want, but they will separate. In the realm of the spiritual, two contradictions are love and evil. They're mutually exclusive. You cannot mix them together. They will not coexist on earth or in heaven. That's contradictions. What I'm talking about is not contradiction. What I'm talking about is a paradox. A paradox is two things that appear to be mutually exclusive, that will not work together. But in truth, they will. And faith is a paradox. And here's the paradox of faith. We're responsible for our own lives. But if we choose to follow Jesus, then we have to give up some control over our own lives. No, the truth is we have to give up a lot of control over our own lives. Jesus did say, he who would find his life must lose it. That was Jesus' way of saying that the way of faith is the way of surrender. Paradox is something. Two things that ought not to work together, but they will. How do they work together? We surrender. We experience victory. You're not supposed to be able to do that. We give up control of our own lives and offer some of our decision making to God. And in doing that, we discover that we wind up with more control over our own lives than we ever had before. We advocate leadership of our lives to God, and we discover that people wind up looking to us more than they did before for leadership, because when they look at us, they sense something in us that they've never seen before. We make ourselves less and God more, and we wind up being more. How do you make yourself less and wind up being more? That's the paradox of faith. You don't explain a paradox. You just kind of step back and take it all in and say thank you. We just reach a point in life where we accept some things with the trust that if God is behind it, it's going to work out no matter how it looks to us at any given point. In conclusion, let me say, the map of your life and my life does not need to look like this map. If it does look like this map, that's on us. Just as the 40 years of wandering in the desert of Sinai was on them. Because they were meant for better, we are meant for better. God intended different and better for them. And God intends different and better for us. But we have to claim it. We have to own it. And how do we do that? By including God in a more faithful, constant, and consistent way as we make our journey from where we are to those more ultimate destinations in our lives.